Bom dia a todos e todas. É um prazer recebê-los na segunda mesa redonda do Núcleo de Concorrência, Políticas Públicas, Inovação e Tecnologia, com pitch da FGV Direito SP. Let me shift to English now, as we have an international conversation today. First, I'd like to make the usual disclaimer in all FGV webinars. All statements expressed by Fundação Getulio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participation in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV's official channels. Well, this is a series of roundtables about competition and digital platforms that tries to bring together conversation between academics, practitioners, policymakers, and market players. And today we have three distinguished guests with us. Renato Nazzini, professor at King's College London and partner at LMS Legal in London as well. Juliana Oliveira Domingues, who is Attorney General at Cade, the Administrative Council for Economic Defense, and also a professor at the University of São Paulo. And Juliana, I think we can't see you. Oh, there you are. Thank you. So welcome, Juliana. Thanks for being with us today as well. And also, Juliana leads the Escola chapter in Brazil. So it's a great pleasure to have you here with us, Juliana. Fabio Riva. Fabio is a professor at FGV graduate programs and also VP at ZTech, which is the Initiative for Digital Transformation at the company AB InBev in the world and at Ambev in Brazil. So our conversation today will focus on standards of analysis of merger control in digital markets. There has been significant discussion worldwide about whether competition authorities should change their standards of analysis and adjust burdens of proof when looking at mergers specifically in digital markets. Some argue that current standards are too soft, allowing some harmful mergers to be approved, while others believe that changes in the standards of analysis and burdens of proof would create more uncertainty, restrict freedom of enterprise, and potentially chill transactions that might be positive in very dynamic markets. Renato wrote a provocative article last year for Jota here in Brazil about these issues. So I'd like to kindly ask him to lead the conversation, bringing some of his ideas and the updates about this discussion with an European perspective. And then the idea is to have a conversation, true conversation among the four of us. So thank you again, Renato, for joining us from London. It's a great pleasure. You're already a friend of FGV. You've been here visiting us in 2020, and we hope to have you here shortly as well. But thank you for joining from the other side of the Atlantic.
Muito obrigado, Caio. Bom dia a todo o nosso público no Brasil. Bom dia, boa tarde e boa noite ao nosso público internacional. Estou muito grato por ter sido convidado para este evento. Muito obrigado ao professor Pereira Neto e à FGV pela iniciativa de organizar um evento tão oportuno. Agora mudo para o inglês, que é a língua de trabalho deste seminário. So thank you very much once again for the invitation, Caio, Professor Pereira Neto, and to FGV. As Professor Neto said, I wrote a piece for Jota in about 1 year ago, and I'm going to share some of the views expressed in that piece, of course, in light of some new developments as well that have taken place in the meantime. The starting point of this all is that there has been over the past few years an increased unease about concentration in digital markets and about the position that a few players, and we can name them, I mean, obviously Google, Alphabet, Apple, Meta, Facebook, and Amazon are always included. Then you can argue whether Microsoft, eBay, and Netflix should also be included within this category of big techs, and perhaps other companies as well, also depending on the regional scope. But more generally, without making this about this or that company in particular, of course, the idea is that these digital spaces are more and more concentrated or show a high degree of concentration. And we can, assume that this is the case for the purpose of this discussion. I mean, the question is whether merger control could have done or can do anything about that. So concentration in digital markets, and the other piece of evidence that is looked at very often and cited is the number of acquisitions that these big tech companies make in these markets. So there is a kind of tendency in terms of acquisition counting. So Google has acquired over such and such period X company, and Facebook, 70, and whoever has acquired more. And combining this evidence with also evidence of anti-competitive effects or anti-competitive practices going on. We are all aware of the investigations that have been concluded or are ongoing against Google, Apple, Amazon, and others, led to this view shared by many, I would say, that something must be done in the area of merger control. When I say shared by many, I don't mean shared by all, not necessarily by the majority, but certainly there is a growing body of scholarship, a growing body of opinion, views from competition authorities, views from politicians that merger control has perhaps not worked as well as it should have done in order to prevent these perceived problems in these markets. Now, I just pause for a moment because while we all must acknowledge that whenever there is concentration, whenever there is some market power, of course, there may be issues. Some are competition law issues, some are not competition law issues. I think about concerns relating privacy, as we say in England, concern relating to personal data and the use of this data, concerns around harmful content, concerns around political influence, especially at times of elections, concerns about the health of, for example, young users who spend too much time on these platforms, concerns about fairness of businesses that perhaps are completely dependent on eBay or Amazon. I mean, these are by and large non-competition concerns, I think. There may be something at the margins, but they are not really competition concerns. There may be competition concerns around practices such as self-preferencing, for example, or refusal to allow interoperability. But with these harms on one side, we also have to think about the huge benefits, obviously, that the digital economy has brought about in terms of giving consumers and businesses unprecedented opportunities, driving up value and driving costs down. Just let's think about what the pandemic would have been without the digital platforms and the digital ecosystems that we have today. So against this background, let's move on and look at what the proponents of change put forward and have put forward in the past few years. I would say these proposals are many, and every article and every scholar, has his or her own view on these things. But I would organize them in three categories. Proposals to change the substantive test for merger control, proposals to reverse the burden of proof for merger control, and proposal to change the standard of proof. And all these proposals have something in common, of course. When two companies merge, or one company acquires another company, a business acquires another business, competition authorities can stop the merger if the applicable test is met. This test could be substantial lessening of competition or creation or strengthening of a dominant position. It varies from, of course, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The objective of all these proposals is to make it easier for competition authorities to block mergers. Some of these proposals are put forward as general proposals, but many are actually put forward as proposals that should apply to acquisitions by big tech companies. Let's start with proposals to change the substantive test. For example, just a couple of examples. In the United States, the current test, as many of you know, is substantial lessening of competition. So a merger can be blocked by a court if it's likely, or more likely than not, that it will substantially lessen competition. One proposal is, of course, to change substantial to material. And you can see how the change of this word makes a huge difference. Unless there is a merger between really two completely unrelated companies, a private equity fund that for the very first time acquires a company that has nothing to do with any other company in the portfolio or something like that. Most horizontal mergers, for instance, will have as an impact some lessening of competition. I mean, the idea of having substantial is to have a clear threshold. Material would give huge discretion to competition authorities to block pretty much very many horizontal mergers and quite a few vertical mergers as well. In the United Kingdom, there was a proposal in the Furman report, the report commissioned by government to look at the digital economy as a whole, not just in relation to competition law, but in this Furman report, there was a proposal in relation to the merger test. And the proposal was to move from, again, substantial lessening of competition, which is the test in the UK, to a balance of harms. This balance of harms test would have worked in this way. The competition authority could have stopped the merger, even if the harm, the likelihood of the harm occurring would have been quite low, if the magnitude of the harm, nevertheless, would have been very significant. So the idea is, Facebook is acquiring Instagram. How likely it is that Instagram is going to become, in the foreseeable future, a very strong competitor of Facebook and really create huge competition and value and maybe displace Facebook in the social network space? Quite unlikely. However, if actually Instagram manages to do that, then there would be huge benefit to consumers. Therefore, the merger should be stopped. So this test, I think, I put it as a substantive test rather than a kind of standard of proof or test, as it was also presented, because it really is a test that gives huge discretion to a competition authority to do pretty much what they want. And quite rightly, the Competition and Markets Authority itself, the CMA, the UK Competition Authority, rejected this test, saying that it was not necessary. And I think part of it, that's just my impression, part of the reason for rejecting it by the CMA is that sometimes too much unfettered discretion is unwelcome, even for competition authorities. It may feel good to be able to do whatever you want, but then you have to have some kind of structure and some kind of firm principles to act. It was just too broad a test. It's a test which is dead completely in the United Kingdom, but I think it's interesting from a kind of for the discussion from the theoretical perspective. Let me now move briefly to the burden of proof. The proposals here would be to say that if a big tech company, however defined, I mean, there are proposals, as you know, to designate companies as gatekeepers in the European Union, as having gatekeeper status, significant market impact, or strategic market impact is the terminology in the UK. But there are many proposals around the world that would, in a sense, list the big tech companies that have some degree of substantial market power. And then perhaps for these companies, there was a proposal to reverse the burden of proof in mergers. So obviously now a competition authority must prove that the test is met as a matter of fact. Under these proposals, it would be for the merging parties to prove either that the merger produces efficiencies or that the merger is in the public interest, otherwise the merger is blocked. It's essentially a prohibition of mergers by big techs unless they prove that the merger should go forward. I find this also quite difficult to comprehend, because why should the merger be blocked if at the end of the day the competition authorities has no evidence that it should be blocked? I also think it would put companies in a very difficult position, because how do you prove that the merger is pro-competitive if you don't know the case that is brought against you? There is very little guidance in the case law and in practice, certainly in the European Union and in the United Kingdom, on the so-called efficiency defense, on what companies should or can prove to have a merger cleared, simply because this is not how the system works. Whenever or very often when an efficiency defense is put forward, it's just dismissed by saying that there is not enough evidence or doesn't meet the required standards. So big legal uncertainty here as well. And finally, in relation to the standard of proof, for example, in the United States, several scholars proposed to lower the standard of proof from the current standard, which is the balance of probabilities, the classic civil standard in common law countries. So the merger must be more likely than not to cause a substantial lessening of competition, to a test which just requires an increased risk of competitive harm. Increased risk, it's, I think, a very wide very wide terminology, again, would give competition authorities significant discretion. In the United Kingdom, the Competition and Markets Authority, while rejecting rightly the Furman report test, this balance of harms test, proposed that the standard of proof for stopping a merger by a big tech company, which would be designated under the new regime, so those companies that would be on a register of companies with strategic market status, could be blocked if there is simply a reasonable prospect of a substantial lessening of competition, whereas the current test in the UK is the same as in the United States, balance of probabilities. Now, luckily and rightly, I think the government that now has published proposals for new legislation, which was in the Queen's speech, which was not delivered by the Queen, by the Prince of Wales this year. The government rejected that proposal by the CMA, and in the UK, there will be no change to the merger test or the merger regime in relation to these big tech companies that are going to be designated. So now, very briefly, I move to my conclusions, if you want. First of all, what I would like to say, I do acknowledge, and absolutely agree that there are issues in the digital economy, as I said at the beginning, as there are in many markets, as there were in the telecommunications markets, in the utilities markets, and there have been in other markets in the past, in operating systems, if we think of the Microsoft case. So none of us can really seriously argue that there should be no intervention in relation to digital markets and the big tech companies. The question is, do we need new tools, or are the current tools adequate? I personally find that there isn't enough justification to change the merger regime to what it is now. Why? Well, first of all, because I think all these new proposals have in common that they create huge legal uncertainty. And legal uncertainty is, first of all, something that in a system based on the rule of law is not really a value. But let's leave aside legal and constitutional considerations for the time being. Legal certainty is also fundamental for businesses. And we need a lively, active merger market, capital market, venture capital market, especially now that the world is going through quite rough seas, if I may say so. Secondly, I think there is a constitutional problem with prohibiting mergers too cool without strong evidence, or shifting the burden of proof in such a way, because many of our legal systems, certainly the European Union, for example, with Article 16 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, recognizes the freedom to conduct business. In the UK, we don't have a written constitution, but it's a fundamental common law principle that people are free to go about their own business unfettered, without interference by authorities or government, unless there is a justification for doing so. And essentially, as I say, prohibiting mergers unless the contrary is proven really is a very significant factor on the freedom to conduct business. Buying and selling shares and companies is really a normal business practice. So we have to be quite sure that this is a good policy. Is it impossible? No, but we need to be quite sure that this is the right way to go based on reasonably solid evidence. And again, I accept, you can never have, when it comes to competition, dynamic markets, absolutely watertight proof, especially when we are looking at global markets and so on. But we should have reasonably sound evidence that the merger regime should be changed. I don't think that in terms of evidence we are quite there yet. Yes, these markets are concentrated, okay, but actual concentration that we can measure today is one thing. Whether that concentration has been caused by mergers that have been allowed and should have been stopped instead, it's quite another thing. Most likely, I believe, these markets are concentrated because there are huge network effects and economies of scale. Acquisition by big techs have come later, in a sense, when they have already established their predominant position in a given ecosystem, and they have then expanded that ecosystem. So is concentration really caused by lax merger review? I'm not sure. Again, I think that mere acquisition counting is not really evidence. So the Lair report, which was commissioned by the CMA, indicates, for instance, that Google acquired 168 companies between 2008 and 2018, Facebook 71, Amazon 60. Now, are these numbers high? Are these numbers low? You can even argue they are not so high, given that these are some of the largest companies in the world and they are active everywhere, and some of these acquisitions were quite small acquisitions. But let's even assume the number is high. What does this number tell us? Really not very much. If there is no evidence of a causal link between these acquisitions and competitive harm, which just counting the acquisitions is not really such, so counting acquisition is not really such evidence, let alone proof. And then finally, I think the third element that is often cited is cases like Facebook, WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, Google double-click. So, oh, these mergers, if we look at them ex post, they should have been blocked. First, there are very few, these mergers that we are told should have been blocked. But secondly, and interestingly, these mergers could have been blocked under the previous legal framework. In Facebook, WhatsApp, in Facebook, Instagram, and in Google double-click, the authorities did look at whether WhatsApp, Instagram, double-click would be potential competitor, would impose a competitive constraint in the future on the acquirers, and came to the conclusion that they would not. So the theory of harm was there. The law was perfectly capable of allowing the merger to be blocked if there had been evidence. Now, I quite do not buy the idea that a competition authority should now be allowed to block mergers if they do not have evidence. Now, there may be problems with the evidence, and I am almost now through my initial remarks. We know that, for example, in Facebook, Instagram, in 2020, during a congressional hearing in the United States, quite a few documents came up which the competition authorities quite a few years before had not seen, which could be seen as evidence of some kind of anti-competitive intent or effect in the acquisition of Instagram. I say could be seen as evidence because, of course, they have not been probed in any merger proceedings. They have not been probed in court. But they were documents that apparently competition authorities did not look at. Now, that is potentially a problem. Merger review is short, is complex, and competition authorities, I think, need to have powers to look at all the relevant evidence. And I come to my recommendations, therefore. So the first one is strong powers to competition authorities, and some of them already have such strong powers, but some do not, to acquire and obtain evidence from the parties and from third parties in merger reviews, power to obtain documents, and severe penalties if these documents are not disclosed, including, I would argue, possibly penalty on individuals, because these documents are and can be crucial. Whether they are evidence or not, who knows, but they have to be looked at by competition authorities. Power to conduct dawn raids if competition authorities don't have them yet. Power to interview individuals, again, under a robust legal framework in case misleading information or false information is provided. Secondly, very strong in-house expertise. The CMA has done it in the United Kingdom. They have a data unit with experts, high-tech engineers, data scientists, behavioral scientists, technology strategic insight advisors that complement the economists and the lawyers in the analysis of these mergers. You really have to understand the markets and the technicalities behind some of these products. So that's absolutely fundamental. And thirdly, I do think that ongoing monitoring is important, and therefore proposals such as those in the Digital Markets Act in the European Union and in the UK government proposals now that certain companies should report all transactions, I think are probably a good idea. I mean, we need more information about these markets. We need to understand what's going on, do proper analysis. And I hope that information about these mergers with the usual confidentiality safeguards can also be shared with the academic community, with the economists, so that we actually can test whether, in fact, these acquisitions are harmful, beneficial, or just competitively neutral. Thank you very much. I'll stop here. Caio, back to you.
Thank you very much, Renato, for this these initial comments. Certainly one step ahead of your on short paper of last year. And I see that you put a cautious approach to changing burdens of proof and to changing standards of analysis, although your recommendations go in the direction of expanding somehow the powers of discovery and analyzing these mergers, keeping the same standards. I think that's maybe a fair account of your last propositions. And with that, I'd like to hear our other panelists, just like brief comments, initial comments on impressions and how this discussion plays on their views. And then we can move to specific issues here. But I'd like to give them initial perspective of their positions and their views on these very interesting issues here. So Juliana and Fabio would like to start with a few comments before we dive into different issues here.
Go ahead, Juliana. Do you want to start?
Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank you, Caio, for this kind invitation. For me, it is a pleasure to be here with Professor Renato and also Fabio Riva, with whom I have had the opportunity to interact before joining the federal government. And I think it is a very important discussion, and I hope to be able to contribute with my vision. I just would like to make a little disclaimer that all that I will say here is my opinion. It means that does not mean the opinion of the Cade's Attorney General Office, and much less Cade's official position. And this is a topic that I have been researching for some time. And so I will do here my collaboration, thinking about expanding a little bit more this reflection, okay? Especially after the presentation of Professor Renato and after reading the paper, I think that we need to think a little bit about the perspective of the Brazilian history. And the big question is, I think in our case, is how many cases do we have to affirm or confirm type 2 errors, that means false negatives in Brazil. And in that case, we must look to our federal constitution from 1988 and remember the presumption of innocence, especially when there is no market power that would lead to a possible anti-competitive practice, or I cannot say some cases or give some examples about this, but the point of view of the control of conduct in Brazil, I already see weaknesses in adopting, more severe rules. Like we have here problems with PERSA rules in controlling concentrations by creating a kind of possibility of negative proof of authorship and what we call here materiality. And I think that in this topic, you can also read a paper from Eduardo Gaban from the Web Advocacy. He wrote about PERSA rule in Brazil recently. And speaking here, obviously, it's all in thesis, right? Never as a position of mine in a concrete case. I understand that the presumption of market power can be acceptable for investigations related to digital markets. or investigations, but never to impose sanctions immediately. There is also a concern about legal certainty in this sense. And I think that Professor Renato touched this. We have another paper from Paolo Buccicosi, right, that explains 3 possible flaws that can be affected by the system of application of standards, just like over deterrence, under deterrence, type 1 or type 2 errors or false positives and false negatives, over inclusion or under inclusion, and all these flaws deserve attention. And we cannot apply remedies out of measure. Nobody wants to kill innovation. But the question, do we need a review? I understand that the dynamics of the digital markets require this reflection. Obviously, I think this is the question. But I'm also concerned about legal certainty, just like Professor Renato. And we are living in a moment that we can see startups being created, already thinking about leverage and be sold. They don't want to compete. And is that wrong? Is that going to eliminate competition? And what the competition authorities must do? Those are the $1 million questions, right? And we need to reflect on the reality of analyzing this market, considering the particularity, not only the design, but also the other environment that we have in the digital economy. We need to move in this debate without denying all the experiences brought over the years in antitrust analysis, but we also need to think about tools to promote innovation. And also in Brazil, we need to protect free enterprise and remember that markets, these markets are very little explored by Cade case law, for example, and we have very significant differences in the analysis from an international point of view, as we could see in the cases like Facebook, WhatsApp in Germany, in Italy, and we didn't have this case here in Brazil notified by Cade. So to date, I do not believe it's possible to say, in fact, how many cases we have that we could put inside the type 2, at least not in Brazil, but I would like to listen the other speakers about this. And thank you, Caio, for giving me this opportunity to share my views and ideas.
Thank you, Juliana. I think that's one of the big questions, right? Whether we have had type 2 errors, right? False negatives that need to be addressed or not. I think it's not clear, and I think from my knowledge also that there is no compelling evidence on one way or the other at this point. And I think Renato has a cautious approach here of saying, look, there are discussions, but it's not clear really that has been a problem of under enforcement, even in the few mergers that have been pointed out, particularly there. Although the uneasiness, right, the perception that more must be done, I think it's really widespread. So we need to think thoroughly about this, and I think Renato also pointed it out towards the end that there seems to be a request for more action. The question is, what's the way of doing it? And I think what you just presented is also a balanced view of being careful with uncertainty, but also think about when you need more or potentially more enforcement. But let me stop here and hear a bit of Fabio Riva. Fabio, it would be great for you to share your views or initial views on this matter, and what perspective can you bring to this discussion, please? Thank you again for joining us, and Juliana also, of course, thank you so much for being here with us. It's always great to have the perspective of the authority. In the sense that, and you just joined Cade, so it's wonderful to hear your thoughts on that, although I fully understand the disclaimer that this is not Cade's view, but it's your own view. It's always like that. So thank you very much. Fabio, please.
Okay, Caio, thank you so much for inviting me and for your kind words also in the beginning. It's always great to hear Professor Nazzini and Professor Juliana also talking about their areas of study and research. Well, to begin with, I think I have to say that the article wrote by Professor Nazzini is an interesting provocation. It raises very reasonable arguments against ideas that have been spreading across the world and supported by important practitioners, important scholars, without so many people seriously challenging it. I think one key argument of the article that caught my attention, and I think it deserves further exploration, including from a Brazilian perspective, is the point about the fundamental contradiction between the proposed changes, particularly the shift in the burden of proof, certain mergers in digital markets, and principles that have been guiding our system of liberal democracy. So a system where freedom of initiative or free enterprise and property are protected by the rule of law. One may argue that in digital market there is public interest that requires some change or such change in view of the power of large tech firms that they have acquired and how much such power can be used against other players and to the detriment of consumers also. And I think this is a valid starting point for a broader discussions based on Brazilian constitutional law. And I haven't seen any article or any discussion about this before, at least in a deep way. And I would love to hear or to read more from a Brazilian perspective, if it makes sense to have changes like this, and if these changes would affect our interpretation of certain constitutional rights, like I said, the freedom of initiative, the substantive due process of law, and whether the public interest argument would remain a basis for justifying an intervention or interference with the rights of certain merging parties in digital markets. And I said certain merging parties in digital markets, of course, making a reference to a potential discrimination here. And I think the second point is more on the effects on innovation. I've been working with innovation, at least for the last 4 years, in tech markets. So I spoke with more than 100 startups, tech startups, and I think we have to discuss whether a reduction of the incentives of large tech companies, whether this would decrease the general level of innovation in digital markets. As we know, innovative tech startups are normally funded by venture capitalists, which only invest because the return on investment is very high in case those startups are successful. In other words, VC firms invest in seed companies, Series A, Series B, Series C funding rounds of innovative companies when they foresee a profitable cash out later. It's good to mention that the most active investors or acquirers of late-stage startups are the large tech companies that have enough resource to afford acquisitions like this. That's how the cycle has been built in the last decades, and this is the cycle of innovation. So a reduction of incentives for large tech companies to invest in those startups, I believe, can take out of the market a substantial part of the fuel that makes the innovation engine work across the world. Will this fuel be replaced by other late-stage investors? I don't know. I don't think so in the beginning, but at least the short term, I cannot see this fuel of innovation being replaced by other investors. That's my initial reaction, Caio, I'll go back to you.
Let me unmute myself, right? I mean, this is the usual of forgetting to unmute. So thank you very much, Fabio. I think both issues are quite interesting. I think thinking on constitutional terms, as Renato proposes, and you bring to the Brazilian context here, I think it's quite important as well in trying to see to what extent some of the proposals may actually restrict fundamental rights, and to what extent they would actually be barred by the constitutional framework here. So I think that's one important issue to be looked at, and certainly a reversal in the burden of proof or some very strong presumptions against certain mergers could abridge some of these freedoms that we've been discussing in some contexts, at least, it seems to me. And the question of innovation, I think it's extremely important, and I think maybe we could go back to Renato on that as well, and then to all of you. I think there's one of the questions about these proposals regarding standards of proof and general standards of analysis of mergers and the substantive tests. I think it's really about not only how it could increase discretion and change the way authorities decide, but also how it would be received on the markets and how it would affect the parties' incentives to negotiate mergers and to actually design transactions. So whether this would have a chilling effect on mergers, or whether this would simply make the merger control reviews more burdensome, I think that's a question that's relatively open. But maybe, Renato, I could turn back to you and also hear you on this. I mean, it's like shifting the look from the discretion of the authorities to actually the merging parties. I mean, what these discussions could influence on the merging parties' decisions when they're looking on decisions about organic growth versus inorganic growth, for instance. I mean, how would you see that?
Thank you, Caio. Absolutely. I think that's a crucial point. And because at the end of the day, merger review and the merger framework that does have an impact on the movements of capital, the market for capital, exit strategies for venture capitalists, and so on. I think there is little doubt intuitively that stricter merger review and longer merger review, a more uncertain merger review, makes an exit strategy that many investors have, specifically venture capitalists with very short cycles, generally 5 years, less likely, more difficult. And therefore, either you don't invest or you invest in higher return companies. I mean, there is no question about it, I think. And there is a recent paper by Daniel Sokol. He was in London actually a couple of weeks ago, Daniel, and we discussed this paper at King's as well. It's a good paper with some empirical evidence too, that points exactly in that direction. And I think I would make 2 additional points here. The first is that although we haven't seen reforms in terms of the reversal of the burden of proof, the change of the merger test, etc., not yet, at least in major as far as I know, in major jurisdiction. We have seen reforms of the merger thresholds, obviously, in a number of countries. Germany was first, and Austria followed, and a number of other jurisdiction too. But I mean, we haven't seen really reform of the substantive test or the burden of standard of proof. But the reality is that merger reviews in this area of the digital economy are already becoming longer, more difficult, and less predictable. I mean, if you look at a case like Meta Giphy in the United Kingdom, now the case was cleared with commitments by the Australian Competition Authority, the ACCC, but it was blocked by the CMA. Now, I mean, there is nothing wrong with that in principle, obviously. I mean, you know, Cade doesn't have to take the same decisions that, you know, the Bundeskartellamt would take. I mean, these are different markets. Each authority looks at its own market, its own test, and so on. But nevertheless, I still think it's interesting that two quite like-minded authorities like the ACCC and the CMA have come to very different conclusions on the same merger. Secondly, and so there is, and you know, there are multiple stories of mergers that have been abandoned internationally, etc. I mean, when there is, you know, it only takes one jurisdiction to block the merger, and you know, and proceedings to go on for ages for the merger to be abandoned very often. And many of these digital mergers are truly global. You cannot easily carve out the EU or Australia or Brazil, etc. Either it's the whole world. Perhaps, you know, China is a story on its own, but you know, it's very difficult to carve out countries from these deals. And secondly, because there is the international uncertainty. There is the length of these reviews nowadays. I mean, you know, we all have in our statutes these nice deadlines like 30 days, 28 working days, you know, 4 weeks and whatever. But how long does a pre-notification phase now last in a, you know, reasonably complicated digital mergers? I mean, months and months, you know, 6 months, 8 months or more. And then you have a phase one, potentially phase two, then appeals. I mean, you know, you can't really, from a business perspective, see that as an appealing system. And the unpredictability in terms of the theories of harm, but because although the tests have not been changed, competition authorities have changed their approach. And again, the CMA is a good example in point. They amended in 2021 the merger guidelines, introducing a new chapter 5, if I recall correctly, which is about dynamic competition. And this dynamic competition, the way they now look at it, it's not just a potential entry story. And, you know, the potential entry story, I think, has always been there. There's nothing particularly new about it. It's a difficult story because you have to have evidence again under the current framework, but you could always, I think, block a merger in case the target was a potential competitor. We would have imposed a significant competitive constraint, would have entered within a reasonably short time frame. But dynamic competition now is intended also as competition which is ongoing even before entry. So they are seen as, in a sense, actual competitors. So the idea that Giphy is there and could, you know, did have display advertising in the United States and could have done the same in the UK, that was enough to consider it a competitor, even if this entry, you know, in a way was quite far away or would never materialize, etc. I mean, the theory of harm comes close to that. So you don't need really entry or that likelihood of entry. It's an actual dynamic competition. And you see that I almost struggle to explain it. So it's quite a fine economic theory. You know, makes a lot of sense in economics. You know, you could have a potential competitor there that never enters, but you know that it could enter, and therefore you continue to innovate and be good and have lower prices and better services, because otherwise you know that if you don't, that guy will come into your market. So, I mean, that, I think economic, I mean, not an economist, but from an economic perspective, that's fine. I mean, the problem is when you then apply these nice economic theories, and you have to look at the evidence, and you have to look at the facts, and then you start blocking mergers based on these theories. In MetaGiffy, the CMA could have blocked the merger purely on the vertical theory of harm. So on the idea that Facebook would not have given gifts to other messaging apps or competitors, and because gifts are now quite important, I'm not a great user of them, but I am a receiver of many of them. So I can see they are important. Maybe they are. It's a matter of fact. I don't know. But let's, there was the vertical theory of harm, which is quite an established one, which could have been dealt with, by the way, with the FRAND commitment. So, Meta should give access to gifts on a fair and equitable and non-discriminatory basis to competitors, but the CMA doesn't like behavioral remedies. So there was the vertical theory of harm, but the CMA included this horizontal theory of harm. And one view is that perhaps they did that to test whether they can then apply the theory of harm in the future, even if the statutory test is not changed. So it's all very interesting. I think all this uncertainty that is already there then does have that impact, I think, on incentives to invest and innovate and in structured transactions. And I just finish on one point, which is actually one question, which is, very often when one makes there is the argument, well, the exit strategy is being acquired. But do you have to be acquired by Google, Meta, Amazon or eBay, or is there no other buyer around? Maybe there are other buyers who would pay a little bit less, but actually would the transaction would be less anti-competitive or not anti-competitive at all. I think it's an argument which is a serious argument. Again, I mean, it's a little bit speculative because we don't have the hard evidence to verify that, but it's a point which is made, and it's obviously part of the debate.
Thank you very much. Fabio, any comment on this perspective from potential merging parties? I think you've probably been involved in evaluations of potential mergers in this tech sphere. You already talked about this exit strategy and how it can be affected, but also from potential acquire of other companies. Do you see any chilling effects or any other concerns that these discussions could generate as well?
Yeah. Well, I think the first point I have is that I think the mere shift in the burden of proof or changes in the regulation itself will not change a lot how the private parties will react. I think the practice and the way the regulators handle this change will I think provoke a reaction in the private parties or potential acquirers. So even if the burden is shifted to the merging party, but the authority take the arguments and the data provided by those parties seriously and not take measures to rewrite the narrative with new requests of data and endless processes. I think it may work well. The incentives will not be affected, even if there are changes in the framework. Of course, the more the more important are the changes in the framework, the higher will be the changes or the chances of reduction in the incentives of the party. I believe on a point that Professor Nazzini raised, I know about several startups that were built and their product development was built on the basis of a potential acquisition of one or two large tech companies in the future. So tech development is very complex. If you focus on a certain feature that could be interesting to one or two tech companies, your chances of success will be higher. So this is another point that we have to take into account in the discussion. Of course, there may be other competitors or other tech companies thinking about acquiring those companies, yes, but innovation is built also on the basis of existing and leading products. And no one can argue against the fact that these companies provide great tech products across the world and to users in general. These are my considerations, Caio.
Thank you, Fabio. I'd just like to remind the audience that if you're watching through YouTube, there is a link for Slido, the app where you can make questions. So if you want to send questions to our panelists, please do. And we're going to try to put them forward here. So it's just a link at the YouTube channel. And then let's shift gears here, and I'd like to get back to a point that I think it's discussed every time this issue is brought. That is the issue on bringing efficiencies forward in some of these mergers. And we had in our first roundtable last month with Nicolo Zingales. He had he discussed this as maybe requiring in few mergers, and usually whoever proposes this says, look, this would be in very few mergers, but that could actually require strongly that the merging parties show a rationale and efficiencies of those mergers in order to get it approved, which is really shifting the burden to this extent, right? It is really presuming that without that demonstration of efficiencies, that merger could not be approved. I think Tommaso Valletti in Europe has been one of the advocates of this as well, always also pushing that in these few mergers that would be those really focused on only very big companies, that these companies would probably have alternatives of organic growth, and that for that reason, it would not be potentially so harmful. So maybe diving a little deeper into this discussion of efficiencies, I'd like to check whether a narrower perspective on this, that only few mergers would qualify for this change, and mergers probably involving parties with lots of resources for organic growth, whether this would change any of the discussion here, because that was part of the exchange in our last roundtable, and I think it's very good to make this bridge among the different discussions here, so that we can see that. So maybe Renato could kick off, and then Juliana and Fabio could react to that. In other words, is there a way to save this discussion about efficiencies, right, that would not bring the problems that you raised on discretion, on too much limitation, and things like that? Because always when I see this discussion, people try not to drop it, but to reframe it in a way that makes it more potentially acceptable. And I'm still skeptical, but I'd like to hear your views on this.
Well, I would say I will start with this observation that although there is a lot of talk about these proposals, I don't think we should be pushed into a corner, or at least people who, for one reason or another, academic or practical experience or economic analysis, do not believe that these proposals are well founded. I don't think that because there is a lot of noise, and even sometimes a lot of, let's say, political or populist support for these proposals, we should be pushed into a corner, and therefore we should say, however, that we have to give something. I was quite pleased, for example, that the UK government said we are not changing anything in relation to mergers, even in when it comes to these big tech companies. And bear in mind, I mean, although I'm not a professor of politics, but so that's more of a really strictly personal observation. Our government today, although it's a conservative government with a very strong majority, it's not really any close to like a Thatcherite or neoliberal government. I mean, they have features and policies that are much closer to a kind of socialist stroke dirigist approach, rather than what was the classic British conservatives in, let's say, the 70s and the 80s. So it's not, I don't think it's a government which, has not shied away from big government intervention, big government regulation, etc. So it's not just political. I think the issue was looked at, notwithstanding the Furman report, a lot of work, a lot of consultation, a lot of analysis, lots of proposals that went into that direction. The government said, not a good idea, really. So, it's not a lost battle at all, I think. I don't know, for example, in the United States, what's going to happen. I mean, it's... these proposals have to go through Congress and Senate and the House of Representatives and the Senate. And, again, although there is a lot of vocal support, etc., we will see, how many Republican representatives and senators and Democrats as well will vote in favor of these pretty, draconian proposals. But I mean, in the EU also, there isn't really any view currently to change the merger test, to shift the burden of proof, etc. So far, we have been in the big reform, of course, is going to be the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, especially the Digital Markets Act when it comes to regulation of these big companies, but not necessarily changing the merger test. But in relation to then, can we narrow it down? First of all, I have more and more, the more you narrow it down, the more you become concerned about, discrimination and constitutional issues, really. You can't pick 3 companies. I mean, you can. I mean, okay, let's not start a constitutional debate. And, but I mean, there is some unease, I think, at least I would feel uneasy just picking 3 companies and say, well, now you are under particular scrutiny in relation to mergers. The argument which goes, yes, but there will be very few mergers, parties with significant resources, etc. But you can do it already then. I mean, you can do it already. I mean, I don't see why, you have to change the system. And if the competition authorities have quite a bit of flexibility already, actually, around the burden of proof and standard of proof. I wouldn't say, it's extremely difficult to block a merger. Things may be different in the United States. I mean, I talk, obviously, we have a Brazilian and also very international audience. Of course, when I say, whatever I say, it's always based on experience and legal knowledge and analysis in the EU and in the UK. So, of course, my sense is that in the United States, things are a little bit different. I mean, you have to go to court, even as an agency, to block a merger. And then, things like the standard of proof and burden of proof, who has to prove what, I mean, matter quite a lot. But in Europe, in the UK, where you have an administrative system, burden of proof and standard of proof are quite blurred concepts. It's, of course, it's already the case that, that merging parties may prove efficiencies, but the burden shifts on them when already there is a kind of theory of harm, which at least prima facie shows that the merger may be anti-competitive. As I say, I mean, we have all sorts of theories of harm under the current framework: potential competition, maybe dynamic competition, innovation spaces after the Dow-DuPont case in the European Commission. So companies that they are not actual competitor in anything, yet they compete in innovation, and not even in products that are very close to development, but in early stages of innovation and investment in innovation. So anything can be blocked that is harmful. And, you know, the more you say that this is only about a few mergers and this is only about a few parties, that, you know, these reviews will be quite exceptional, then again, that's the current situation. I mean, you are describing, so I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question because you wanted me to, you know, propose some kind of narrow down, but this is the current situation, actually, isn't it? It seems to me. And then if you want to change something, it's just that, okay, in these few cases, I don't want to prove that there is harm. But again, I'm uneasy about it. If you can't prove there is harm, then, well, then the merger has to be allowed, I'm afraid. We can't change the law because someone believes it's harmful, but there is no evidence of it, and therefore we block it. I mean, anyway, these are my views. Sorry.
No, I think it's
they
very
are not
fair,
fashionable,
Renato.
but they are not fashionable. But
no, it's a fair way of putting it, and I think it's very good, and it's a good contrast from the discussion we had in the last roundtable, which makes it more interesting and lively to have these different contrasts. So I think it's very, very good. So Juliana, would you like to comment on that? I mean, your views on this issue, or how you think about them? That would be great.
Right. I would not say to be reasonable to require demonstration of efficiency, because we all here from Brazil, we have difficulties to see cases or approvals, decisions only based on the efficiency demonstration. I would like to listen to Professor Caio and Fabio if they all experience an antitrust approval only based on efficiency demonstration. And instead of thinking about it, I think we should think about the digital ecosystems or the powerful platforms. We could think of requiring the demonstration of some values that could jeopardize exposed abusive or foreclosing trends. So, for example, to demonstrate transparency, accessibility, data portability in a post-closing scenario, and of course, I would count on the market counterfactual support for that. But I think the honest debate would be whether raising a little the bar for digital economy mergers would benefit society. It would be good to present it a little bit, mainly in situations with evident problems. And I think that, however, the game rules should be defined beforehand, like the Europeans are trying to do with DNA and DSA. At the end of the day, this is not a problem only for antitrust. Instead, antitrust should be considered in the formula together with other tools. That's why I think we should really think about transdisciplinarity and not only law and economics. We are talking much more about elements from digital economy that involves other professionals. So I think it is very important to have Professor Renato Nazzini here sharing with us his experience, because in the end of the day here in Brazil, we are trying to follow some of the best practices, and we see that everybody is trying to design the best way to see the future transactions.
Thank you, Juliana. I think you raised a very good point on this issue on efficiencies, and just before passing on to Fabio Riva here, I've never seen a merger approved entirely based on efficiencies, and I do think that this is a particular concern, and it's not only about Brazil. I think in many jurisdictions, I mean, efficiencies are taken into consideration, but if the authorities are fully convinced that there is a harm, that there is a problem, it's unlikely that in the absence of remedies, they're going to approve a particular merger just because they believe it's efficient per se. So that's why I'm particularly skeptical of requiring that certain mergers will only be approved based specifically on efficiencies. I think that is very concerning. That's not to say, and I think that's something that not only Cade, but I think other authorities in the world also do, that is requiring a better explanation of the rationale of that particular merger, right? Especially in conglomerate mergers, where it's not, in the past, it would just go through the analysis very quickly. Authorities would not be very concerned with mergers that would not be horizontal or completely vertical. I think what today authorities are doing in what we call conglomerate mergers, which are, I mean, the line, and that was part of the discussion in our last roundtable, the line between vertical and conglomerate are getting blurred in ecosystems, and that's part of the reason why they're looking deeper into this. But the fact is, understanding better the rationale of mergers between companies that are not direct competitors and not direct supplier customer companies, I think that has been done by the authorities. I mean, requesting more explanation, not necessarily efficiencies. And I think that's part of the debate of what's going on. And I think goes to your point also in ecosystems, Juliana. So I think this new view or new requests about conglomerate mergers, I think that is part of this discussion. That's not shifting anything on burdens of proof or standards of analysis. It's just shedding light on new relationships that we didn't really look in other markets before in any depth. But sorry, Fabio, please do bring your views in on this discussion.
Just a few points here. I think the first one is I never seen any case in which efficiencies play that role. The same here, and I believe that we have to be concerned about throwing away decades of construction of competition law and precedents just because there is a problem, and we all recognize there is a problem in digital markets. There is no simple solution, shifting the burden of proof or putting more importance to demonstration of efficiencies. These are all simple solutions to a problem that we didn't understand very well, or we haven't understood very well at this point. I believe that we need to survey more, research more, and then find solutions that are solutions for a complex problem. And it reminds me of the quote of that American journalist that says that for every complex problem, there is a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. And in this case, I think we are talking about some wrong solutions to a problem that is very complex.
Thank you, Fabio. I think this is a very good point, and I think there is a challenge, and the authorities will always face that challenge of needing, like, and that's pretty much what merger guidelines do, right? Needing to reduce complexity and make a step-by-step approach of something that's usually quite complex. There's lots of information involved and all that, but need to be very careful not to do the wrong turn here. Otherwise, you can have impacts that are that you can't foresee exactly how they're going to play in the market. So I think that's a good point. And we're coming towards the end of our conversation. I'd like to remind everyone that if they wish to weigh in with questions, please do through the app. But I'd like to move to the last piece, actually, of Renato's initial remarks, that is about other proposals, right? So I think we've found some difficulties in shifting standards of proof, shifting the substantive tests. There is a question of certainty that is applying what you know, which is already quite open, as Renato has remarked, right? It's not easy, and changing that may create even more uncertainty. But there are potential other types of improvements, right? And Renato has pushed towards more evidence or expanded discovery in some of these cases, as I can read it, and other potential improvements here in this perspective. My question then is, can we think of other additional improvements to what Renato is proposing, and also your reactions, Fabio and Juliana, to these proposals? I mean, how do you see them? So maybe I could start with you two, and then go back to Renato on these issues to explore a bit more. What are the directions that we can deal with some of these uneasiness regarding mergers in dynamic environments? And I think there's one particular issue that is the uncertainty that these mergers bring, right? I mean, these are uncertain environments by nature. I mean, we're not going to solve that. We need to find ways of dealing with this uncertainty. That's what we're discussing here, and I think we need to have reflections on how to deal with this uneasiness from this perspective as well. So I don't know, Fabio or Juliana, would you like to kick off here on potential improvements? I mean, how do you see that, and any other improvements that you may suggest?
Right. Well, I think we all agree here that the dynamics of digital markets are very particular. And in Brazil, I think we have an additional problem with the absence of a competitive culture. We saw during the pandemic what happened here. And in this sense, Professor Nazzini article, I think, brought several ideas, and I really believe since the beginning of this discussion that we need to have a more interdisciplinarity and deal with these topics with those who really understand digital ecosystems. I like the idea of thinking about a more outstanding internal expertise for competition authorities in general, because we are also talking about global players. I'm thinking about not only what we have here in the staff of Cade, but also data scientists, behavioral economics experts, data experts. I think they are all essential to this interaction with the regulators. And we are talking about something far exceeding our economics and law knowledge. By the way, today you saw that now our data protection agency is an agency, right? Just like Cade. We have this news from today, and I dare that it's possible to deal with those topics only with the basic law and economics, and we need to be able to deal with these issues properly if they do not broaden the focus of the analysis. Therefore, I think we must not only think about having a kind of nucleus to have this kind of interaction to deal with those cases involving digital economy, but maybe we think about our notification criteria. I think in Brazil, we must consider the transactions involving large groups that here our threshold criterion didn't help a lot. Such the case we had involving WhatsApp and Facebook case. Maybe we should consider incorporating the Brazilian merger control system, similar twofold criterion for mergers. It means we have the transaction size and also the threshold to see if the antitrust authority must deal with this case or not. I think it is a discussion that we must go ahead. And of course, remember about our constitution basis, the principle of free enterprise must be reinforced. And we have the economic, the law of economic freedom, and we cannot create barriers to new business, but look to the cases that have competition problems that would hardly reach us only with the current standards.
Thank you, Juliana. I think these are very, very helpful. And I think, as Renato pointed out, I think Germany and Austria have moved in those directions of looking at size of transactions as well. I do think, however, that there is one possibility, and just one very brief comment on this, that is because the law allows Cade to request ex post submissions and filings of mergers. One thing that could be done without changes in the law right now would be to have like a group within Cade looking at potential transactions that might be reviewed, and if so, request the submission. So that's one thing that the law already provides for, right? So that's at least one possibility of mitigating this issue that you raise on the thresholds here. So Fabio, last comments on this issue, and then I'll revert for Renato on his last comment so that we wrap up this here. Thank you very much.
So I think we all agree also in a certain extent that changes in the framework are very hard to implement, and they may have an intentional consequence, negative consequences. I believe that we should invest everything on improving the knowledge of the regulator and the authority about the markets, the digital markets. Everything that we can do in that direction will be positive in the mid and the long term. So even your point on post-merger reviews or post-merger notification, they can be useful to improve the knowledge of the authority about the markets. The authority doesn't need to be very restrictive or even change a decision that has not been taken to block a merger, but take it as an opportunity of knowing, understanding, and learning more about the market itself. That's my final point, Caio.
Thank you very much, Fabio. This was great inputs, and thanks for participating. Renato, back to you for your final comments as we're wrapping up this conversation, and thank you again for joining us from London.
Thank you very much, Caio. You know, my last comment, I think, is just to say that we, just to say two things really. Are there problems in digital markets in relation to competition? Yes, there are, I think. As in any other sector, I mean, we can't hide behind the fact that everything is going well. Of course, as I said at the beginning, where there is market power, where there are complex business relationships, when there are positions that are based on network effects, some entry barriers, etc. Of course, there may be competition problems. Is our current framework suitable for dealing with these problems when it comes to merger review? I think the answer is yes, but for the very simple reason that it's a very wide framework with very strong powers on the authorities. Now, I have put forward my proposals. I mean, there is always space for improvement, but I think we already have a pretty good system in terms of dealing with pretty much the removal of any competitive constraint, future, current, past, probably, the potential, dynamic, and whatever you have it. So creating new uncertainty and changing significantly what we know about merge review so far, I think it's not a good idea. And again, I welcome the UK government decision not to go down that route. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, by the way. I mean, so Caio, Juliana, and Fabio, and of course, all the audience, once again, for this excellent event.
Thank you very much, Renato, for joining us. Thank you, Juliana and Fabio. This has been a great conversation. I invite all the audience to come back to the other roundtables that we're going to have in the second semester at Compete FGV SP. And with that, we close here. It's been a very, very interesting conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Juliana, Fabio, and Renato.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.